I'd like to introduce you to Magda Mostafa, who of course you have already met, but let's just go through the reason that we've invited her to be our closing keynote. So, Magda Mostafa is the co-founding partner and principal of Studio TM, a global design consultancy specialising in autism and neuro-inclusive design. She is also Professor of Design at the American University in Cairo and a visiting instructor at the University of Pennsylvania's Weitzman School. She is the author, and many of you will know this, of the Aspects Design Index, the world's first research-based design framework for autism. Aspects was awarded the UIA Triennial Research Award in 2014, and Magda is the only laureate to have been presented with this award on 2 occasions, again awarded in 2023 for her autism-friendly university guide. Through her consulting, Aspects has been used in architecture for autism and neurodiversity across 5 continents and has been presented globally as well in the recent 2021 and 2023 Venice Biennale through 2 solo shows. She collaborates globally with leading architectural practices, including JSA and Mixed Design, an inclusive design consultancy based in New York, where she's a partner and leads their autism and neuro-inclusive design lab. You did meet Magda this morning. So many of you spoke to Magda throughout the 2 days, but I'm really, really pleased to have her here to share what she can tell us about inclusive school design for students with autism. Thank you, Magda.
So I thought at the end of a very long but very informative day, it would be nice to have a little bit of story time. So hopefully that won't put you to sleep, but that will engage us in a little bit of a conversation. So it's a story about expertise, but not my own expertise, the expertise of the autistic individuals that I have had the pleasure and honor to have met, worked with, collaborated, and published work in the span of the 25 years I've been doing this work. So this is their story, told through an anthology of my own work and my own career, but specifically pinpointing the points in which these interactions happened and the moments that I met these various individuals who I'm very privileged to have been able to meet and work with, and the changes they made to the trajectory of our work. So that's kind of the framing idea of tonight's story. And I want to start with something that I believe in very strongly, that when we design, we've been talking about this all day today, but when we design for autism, we design for everyone. And there's a lot of data that we've been collecting, and I'll show you some of it later on. The data supports that when we design for autism, we design for everyone. But I think more powerfully that when we design not only for autism as an object, but with autism as an agent and by autism as an author, we design even better for everyone, not only for the autistic experience. So before we begin, I want to talk a little bit about language, because I think it's so important. Language is so powerful in signaling not only what we want to say at the most surface level, but where we stand, where our values stand, what our priorities are, and what positionality we come from when we're talking about something, because I feel it really can limit us, or it can really expand the way we can communicate and engage. And I'll start with the language that I'll be using today. So I use identity-first language, so I'll be talking about autistic individuals. The reason I use and choose that language is because that is the language that the autistic individuals that are in my life that I work with have shared with me is their preferred way of identifying themselves, so I respect that. I also respect the fact that that may not be language that everyone in the room is comfortable with or uses for themselves, but that my choice to use that language is informed by those autistic individuals that I work with. But also in relation to language, I think it's important to think about the word autism itself. So the Latin roots of the word autism come from auto, which is self, individual. So it's almost, in using the word autism, committing an individual to this life of being alone, because by definition, we are defining that identity through its singularity, which can be problematic. And I work, as Ben said, all over the world, and I've kind of started gathering a glossary of autism language and what people refer to as autism in different cultures. And that word of being alone translates. So I speak Arabic as well. Autism in Arabic is tawahud, which comes from the word wahad or wahid, which is also one and singular. But not surprisingly, I found a very beautiful word for autism from this part of the world. So the Maori word for autism is takiwatanga, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which means in your own time and space. And I think it's so beautiful because it gives agency to the individual and celebrates the individuality of how you can be autistic in your own time and space. And there's a grace that's given to allow for that. So these are just a few examples of why I think language is so important. Another point on language, Jody this morning gave a fantastic presentation about human-centered design, and I think set us all up to commit to be better human-centered designers and co-designers. A few years ago, I was invited to the Chicago Biennale to do a talk about shaping the city through the autistic and neurodivergent lens, and we named our panel Architecture for the People. And there was this huge debate, is it architecture for the people, architecture by the people, architecture of the people? And everyone was so concerned with the of, by word. I was more concerned with the word people. Who did we mean when we said people? And I take that same question to human-centered design. Who is at the center of that circle? Because more often than not, the person that comes to mind in a design exercise is a white, 6 foot tall, able-bodied, seeing, hearing, English-speaking, affluent, cisgendered, straight male. If we were to poll this room, that identity would probably apply to not a majority of those participants, and yet we have spent centuries of our design framing our design decisions around that singular identity. So that person at the middle of our human-centered design sometimes is identified in a very narrow lens, and we need to stretch that and expand that and ask ourselves, who is it that is at that center of human-centered design? So in continuing my conversation around language, even the word inclusion itself, well-intentioned, important, powerful, but I'm always concerned with what's not being said when we use a word, that whispered, silent subtext. So when we say inclusion, what we're whispering is there's someone excluded outside, that we have to then intentionally bring into the space. When we say accessibility, we say the same thing. We have to say that there is someone who is not granted access, that I have to take intentional, additional, exceptional steps to grant that access to. And that's problematic because that unspokenness is an othering. It is saying that there are others outside of our spaces that we now need to add new budgets and do new processes and put new codes and comply to new standards so that we can bring them into this space. So over the past few years, I've been experimenting with different kinds of languages to capture what it is that we're doing and how it is we think about and signal the positionality of our approach. And we've landed on the word for the moment of availability. And what I like about the word availability is that it's more democratizing. It breaks down this hierarchy of othering. So if a space is available, so we've been talking a lot today, how can we create spaces that are intended for individuals that have specific needs, but then make it flexible enough that everyone will use so it's not stigmatizing of those who end up using it. And availability solves that. It creates this space that anyone can use. And again, speaking of language, and I learned a new word, Auslan, so Australian Sign Language, I'm assuming. So in ASL, American Sign Language, the sign for inclusion in American Sign Language is you make a fist and you make a tiny little hole, and you fit your fingers into that hole. So that says so much, and I love sign language because it is so powerful and visual. You are asking the person that is outside of that space to make themselves into something else that they may not originally be. You're making them, quote unquote, they have to be normal to fit into your norm, to be included into your space. So it speaks volumes, this little gesture. So a few years ago, I was in DC. I did some work with an Intentional Spaces conference with Johns Hopkins University, and as part of that, I was in conversations with individuals at Gallaudet. I work with Hansel Baumann, who wrote the deaf space guides for Gallaudet. And I learned through this process a vernacular term that the community at Gallaudet had came up with for American Sign Language slang for inclusion. And that is open-palmed, and it allows you to enter the space from any point, from anywhere you want to. So it's more invitational. It's less normative, so you could enter in any shape or form. You don't have to make yourself something to come into the space. So I think that's really powerful, and that's maybe one of the reasons I'm so obsessed with language. The panel this morning also talked about code compliance. So I'm often asked, why don't you create a code? Why don't you turn your work into design standards? And I'm always resistant to that because I feel that the process is much more nuanced and much more a gradient of solutions than a single solution that can apply. It's so situational, it's so cultural, it's so contextual, that to standardize it, I think, would be a disservice to the gradient of the power that it could possibly have if it's done on a case-by-case basis. The problem with code compliance as well, with all respect to all the practicing architects, I'm a practicing architect too who has to comply to code, but to quote some of my American colleagues, code compliance is another word for how bad your building is legally allowed to be. So if we start with code compliance, I'll quote another one of my colleagues, Karen Breitmeyer, who I work with very closely. She calls code compliance the basement. That's where we start, but we have to elevate way up above that. So where code compliance does the minimum, let's make sure we do no harm. Let's make sure that neuro-inclusion is not, neurodiversity and language is not included in any codes that I know of that are legally required, with very, very few exceptions. And they are typically looking at a deficit model. So they're framing disability through a medicalized model. On the other side, availability looks at this notion of flourishing. It uses neuroaffirming language, and it is based on a strength-based model. So rather than looking at disability as a cost or an expense or a burden that communities have to bear, it's looked at as an asset or a power or an expertise that can be brought into our spaces. And that's also why I think availability is such an important way of thinking about this. Sympathy and empathy. A lot of times, and Jody talked about this as well this morning, empathy is the basis for this type of co-design. It's the first step in instruction we give to people to approach these problems empathetically. But so many times when I work with clients, what is really happening is not empathy, it's sympathy. Because there is that unavoidable power dynamic of, oh, we have to do this for this individual's needs. So we need to deconstruct that model, and all of you are familiar with the disability model. I don't have to go through the history of it, going from the medicalized model that we lived in for centuries to the functional, social, and now cultural models where we're at. And in parallel to that, we moved from a sympathy model to an empathy model. But today, the model that I like to work with, and I'm borrowing here the autistic sociologist's terminology, Damian Milton, of double empathy. Not only empathy, but empathy that goes both ways. And the best example I can give for that is a mother explaining that she was called into one of the schools of her child with the complaint that her child didn't know how to play with her friends at recess, so she was being kept in the classroom because she's being disruptive in recess because she wanted to play certain games in certain ways and she wasn't cooperating with her colleagues. So the mother came in and asked the teacher a simple question. Are the colleagues trying to play in the way she wants to play? Why is it the burden on her to play in the way her colleagues want to play? Why is there not a double empathy that goes both ways between them? And that brings me to that idea, this notion of this expertise model, that autism and neurodiversity is actually the best source for the expertise that I have found that has informed the entire trajectory of my work over the 20 some odd years that we've been in. Another concept that I'm very committed to is this lifespan model, and I know that this is not unusual and something that many of us are thinking about. It's this model that understands autism and neurodiversity throughout a lifespan. It's not something that we grow out of, it's not something that it may evolve, it may change, but it's something that is part of our identity throughout our entire life, and we need to think about the architectural infrastructure that then supports that. And that support needs to go horizontally, so we need to think of diagnostic assessment spaces and intake spaces. We need to think about K-12 education. We need to think about higher education. We need to think about supported living, and we also need to think about how individuals are aging and the health care that they will be provided with and where that will happen. We also have to think vertically across that model. And what are the cultural infrastructures, the cities and the spaces around this core learning career path trajectory, and think about the typologies and the architectures we're creating in those spaces. And the lifespan model is one of the reasons I've recently started working a lot on cities. Because cities are, to quote my colleague David Rubin, who I'm collaborating on with a very interesting project in Washington, D.C., cities are the interconnective tissue that we all live in. And I always say that as good a job some of our architects are doing to create inclusive buildings, if inclusive buildings sit within a city that is not inclusive, they are just islands of inclusivity within a sea of inaccessibility. And people can't get and live a meaningful, full life without being able to navigate through all of that. So my work began early 2000s, has been going on, and I'm very lucky and privileged to have been able to do this work. But the most common question I'm also asked, and I've been asked it throughout the course of these 2 days, is how did this all begin? When did it start and why did it start? And the short answer is necessity is the mother of invention. So in 2002, I was a young architect. My husband and I had just started our architectural firm. I just had my first child. She was 5 months old. I was called by a group of parents to come in and help design one of the Middle East's first schools for autism. And I was very naive. I knew nothing about autism. I knew nothing about neuroinclusion. And I thought, being a good student, I'd look up some standards, regulations, guidelines somewhere in the world. I'd find a chapter tucked away in all the other disability standards about autism design guidance, and I would apply it, and everything would be fine. I found nothing. I still have a letter that I communicated to the International Building Council about the disability codes and accessibility codes that they themselves were just putting out, with the question if they knew that if there was anyone who was working on this. And the letter was very simple. I got a response back: we do not have, nor do we know of, any systems, guidelines, practices, standards anywhere in the world that is looking at this issue. Parallel story, I was working on a proposal. There are a lot of PhD students in the room, so you'll sympathize to this situation. I was working on my doctoral proposal. I'd spent about 18 months putting together what I thought was an incredibly important piece of work. And I went to my mentor, who is my father-in-law. He is the quintessential architect's architect. He worked for Perkins & Will. He worked for one of the biggest architectural firms in the Middle East. They're one of the top 10 firms always. And I showed him this other proposal of work, and he'd looked at it and he read it, and he said, "You know that where this is going to end up?" And I said, "Well, maybe people will reference it, it will be published, I'll be able to present it at conferences." He said, "It's going to end up on a shelf somewhere. No one's going to read it, no one's going to find it interesting." So I could have done one of two things. I could have crumbled into a postpartum heap of despair, thinking that I'd wasted 1.5 years of my life, or I could resist and ask a question. So I asked him, why? Why is this useless? He said, "Well, I'm a practicing architect. I'm going into the office tomorrow, and what you're proposing here doesn't help me solve any of the problems I'm going to be asked to solve. Come to me with a problem that needs to be solved." So I told him the story about this little school that I thought was an inconsequential little side project that my husband and I were going to work on. It was a tiny little house. It was a 4-classroom school at the time. And I told him I wasn't finding any guidelines. He said, "That's the problem that you should be tackling." I had 6 weeks to my deadline. I called my advisor, God rest her soul, an incredibly brilliant woman who was a pioneer very much in her own right. She knew nothing about autism. She didn't even know what it was. I had to send her a definition, but she agreed with the condition that I met my 6-week deadline. So what I had done in 18 months, I then had to recreate in 6 weeks, come up with a new proposal, defend it in front of my boards in order to get it considered. And because I'm here today, we succeeded. It was done, and we spent 1.5 years working with the school to create what ultimately became the Autism Aspects Design Guide. So the first inflection point in that timeline that I promised I'd talk to you about began with one of the little boys in this school. I won't disclose his name, but his mother shared with me the story of a class that he was in, again, that a teacher called her in. He's being disruptive. We're trying to find activities to keep him occupied during the day so he isn't so disruptive, and they suggested a photography class. They sent him out with his little camera and a list of things he was supposed to take photographs of, a boy, a tree, a house, and so on. And he came back the next week to the photography club with a set of images, and the teacher called the mother up and said, "I'm sorry, this isn't going to work. He didn't follow instructions. He doesn't understand the exercise." So in the wisdom of mothers, she went in and insisted on looking at the photographs. These are recreations. We don't have the original photographs anymore. But what she very quickly realized is he wasn't taking pictures of the images themselves. And the teacher's critique was that the images he asked for were not in the frame. But what her son was taking pictures of were the silhouettes, the reflections, and the shadows of those objects. Because to him, those were those objects. Because that was the way he navigated his world. So what his teacher was seeing as distracted behavior because he wasn't making eye contact in the classroom was actually this brilliant self-designed coping mechanism that he had devised so that he could follow the movements and the instruction in the classroom by following her shadow, by following his friend's shadows on the walls, by following reflections in puddles. So he could navigate the world without having to deal with all the details of actually looking at the object. He could see the distilled silhouette that's just a black and white form that also moves in directions that he could follow. So this was my first moment of insight into autistic expertise. This was a nonverbal boy, and probably very few people would have considered him an expert, but we did. And we continued to adopt that approach of autistic expertise throughout the observations that we did in the school. We looked at the behaviors that were happening. We documented them in a very intentional way. We were looking at 3 outcome measures. So attention span. One of the teachers, when we were doing the early scoping exploratory surveying, we surveyed about 200 parents and caregivers, teachers from all over the world, and then had in-depth interviews with the teachers themselves with the simple question. I told them, I'm going to be redesigning your classrooms. Don't worry about the architecture. Don't think about the design, but tell me one wish. What do you want to happen? And one teacher said to me, there are these golden moments, and the teachers in the room will perhaps, this will resonate with them. She said, there are these golden moments when I have my child's attention, where I have a window of undivided attention. They're focused, they're in the flow, we can get so much done, and then it's gone. She said, if you could make that window a little more frequent and a little bit longer, that's what I want. I don't know how architecture can do that, but let's try if that's our objective. And that became my brief. How can I make that window a little bit more frequent and a little bit longer? So our outcome measures spoke to that. We looked at attention span, we looked at latency, ability to get on task in short periods of time, and we also looked at behaviors that indicated overstimulation that distracted and took students off of task. And the results we finally published in 2008, and after almost 5 years of iterating on other projects, the school moved to a different site and then another different site, so we were able to iterate and prototype some of the classroom interventions, and ultimately came up with the Autism Aspects Design Guidelines. So in their first iteration, there are 7 principles. I'll go through them very quickly, but I think it's better to illustrate them through case studies. We later expanded them to 8 more to include the final 15. And as Ben said, it's being used around the world. And I've really had the privilege to work with so many different institutions. I really should put Melbourne up there now and update this map. So very quickly, acoustics. It will always be part of any conversation when you're talking about autism and neurodiversity. Spatial sequencing is really just about taking the task analysis, the day in the life, and reflecting it in form so that a child moves through a space as seamlessly as possible in a way that's predictable and expected. Escape is creating spaces that people can retreat to. We've talked a lot about the ability to retreat and sensory regulate, and to spread those out and stitch them together throughout our space to create what I call an escape-scape. Compartmentalization, and we've been talking about flexibility today a lot. It's about curating your spaces to break them down into manageable pieces where you don't have sensory information that you don't need for the task that you're doing. And it doesn't mean segregation, it's curation. And it's very important that we understand that, and can be done at different scales from the interior all the way up to the city. Transition. It's building the spatial infrastructure that allows you to switch gears, to regulate, to take that moment, to gather yourself, to settle yourself, to prepare yourself before you go on to the next task, whatever that task is. As architects, we're taught to zone by function and utility, but what Aspects calls for is to layer on top of that sensory zoning and think about the sensory qualities in our spaces of high stimulation and low stimulation and organize them. And of course, safety, we could dedicate an entire lecture of what that means because it means so many different things, from material choices and spatial organization and operations and so much else. Aspects 2.0 looks at the more tectonic elements of space, of color, lighting, materials, furniture, but also the more operational things like wayfinding and navigation, technology, programming and operation, and so on. So I want to start by looking at 3 examples of schools that operationalize and spatialize aspects. Beginning with a school in the Middle East, which was an interesting school because it was part of a huge, almost 1 million square foot residential multi-use development that had museums and a sports arena and a library, hotels, residential, businesses. But what was so interesting about it is in its original brief, the requirement for the developers, we helped develop standards that all of the businesses that would be opening and operating would have to also adopt these neuro-inclusive principles so that the autism school that was on the campus of this development would be able to find job placement, would be able to find museums, would be able to find that lifespan model, those other layers outside of the school that they could go to and engage in their communities. And it's a good example of very compartmentalized, clustered design. The sensory garden is really at the heart of it. The classrooms are compartmentalized in a way. We used landscape in a way that I think that was very interesting, because landscape in the outdoor space can be such a powerful sensory tool. You get smell, touch, sound, movement, balance, so many things you can do in the outside world. This is another project that is still in progress, which is why I can't share too many details about it. But the system that we used here, I think, is really powerful. It's a combination of a day in the life analysis, which was inspired by the OTs that I work with and the therapists that I work with that break down their students' lives into these tiny little pieces that can be more manageable. And it combines that with a stitching together of what we call the sensory infrastructure. So if you follow that arrow, we think of our responsibility as designers even before students arrive to the schools that we're designing. So at the threshold of arrival begins our responsibility at that space where our building meets the city. We don't think that our responsibility ends at the door of the school. We always stretch out beyond, because that moment of arrival and handoff and transition is so important and key to set a student up to either a successful day or a disastrous day. So upon arrival, the very first thing is transition. You create the infrastructure of the space for the transition to happen. You enter the school, and then you transition again before you go to your class space. And then maybe in your class space, you're pulled out or pushed in for a one-to-one session, and then you transition again before you maybe go to a sensory room or have some sensory curriculum or move to a flex space and another therapy one-to-one. And then you use play as another transition form, and then you end your day, hand off to your parent, and depart. So this was generated out of a very deep and extensive stakeholder engagement process to try and craft that typical day in the life. And the reason it's important is because based on our spatial sequencing model, our architecture then needs to reflect that, so that the student is moving as seamlessly as possible through those processes. And of course, not all students will have the same IEP, not all of them will have the same day in the life. So our challenge is how do we as designers then create a single building that can operate in all these multiple ways that are still as seamless as possible for the students. And the secret to that is the sensory infrastructure model. Another project that I'm very proud of, and the reason is because I have an excellent client. This is for the Els for Autism Foundation, and the autistic voice that inspired the Els for Autism Foundation is Ben Els, who's the son of Ernie Els and Liesel Els, and they created this foundation as an inspiration from his needs as an autistic young man. It's an amazing facility because it embodies and spatializes his lifespan model. They have on a singular campus autistic individuals from 6 months to 60 years old. So across that whole lifespan, they provide services in a very efficient, state-of-the-art way. And I was brought in 2014, about a decade ago when they first started. They had only built their elementary school at the time, so I was brought in to do a post-occupancy of the elementary school. I wasn't involved in the original design, but they were very committed to learning from what they had already built before they started building out the rest of the campus. And that's why I say they are such a unique and phenomenal client. I don't think good projects can happen without good clients. So we had a year-long project. I went in, I did these observations and looked at their classrooms in the different spaces, came up with these prototypical, again, this was a result of engagement with an observation with the teachers and the therapists and the clinicians that work on the campus to create these prototypical classrooms. They look a little messy here, but they are actually a series of modules and a kit of parts that teachers could then assemble and use like a puzzle to create what they needed in the classroom. It was all built out of furniture they already had and modules they were already using. So out of the infrastructure that they already had, we came up with these templates. The teachers were experimenting with them, set up their classrooms based on them. We also changed some color scheming because there was some navigation problems and put some acoustical modeling in the spaces. We also added what has become a cultural phenomena on the ELS campus. We call it the purple pods. And it just so happened that when we spec'd and selected this little couch to put outside in strategic places, outside of the sensory room and outside of the classrooms, we chose this lavender purple color out of the catalog. And it has now become the culture because students' behavior has been conditioned. When they see a purple pod-like space, they know that this is transition and sensory regulation space. So in all the other buildings that were built out on campus, we created different versions of purple pods. And the purple pods I'm quite proud of because although they're very simple as an idea, and they were put in place as a transition as students come in from the playground or from music or from art, from a very hyped, overstimulating activity, and are expected to go into their classrooms, get on task and work hard and be focused, they're expected to do that immediately. But once we put the purple pods in the space and invited the students to use it at their own discretion when they needed it, they were able to sit and regulate. And it's very quiet, surprisingly quiet, even though it's open. You step into it or sit into it and there's like this hush of sound. It's really very powerful. One of the unexpected results of this research is that the students then started requesting time in the purple pods as reward for tasks completed in the classroom. And this was entirely student-driven. No teacher had ever offered it. A student just one day said, instead of getting time on my iPad or time to bounce on the trampoline, can I go outside and sit in the purple pod? So it became one of the reinforcement structures. Another kind of accidental observation that happened when we were talking about earlier, and I apologize I didn't catch the name, we were talking about that learning happens in schools outside of the classrooms, and corridors in schools are such social spaces, and initiating social engagement and communication can sometimes be a challenge for some autistic individuals. In these purple pods, students that hadn't prior to this initiated conversations with their colleagues in the corridors now felt safe to do so. So when they were in the purple pod, they were like in this little bubble of safety, and they could call over a friend or they could call over a teacher and start a conversation where before they would have never had done any kind of social interaction like that. So I went back a year later and did a post-occupancy, which was really very rewarding. We were able to gather data and survey the teachers and publish the results together with the teachers. But then we carried on this process. And 2 years ago, I was brought back to the campus to look at one of their new builds. And this, I had the opportunity to really engage in a co-design process and use engagement as a driver of that design, which again is so rare and speaks to having good clients that understand the value of the process. So we did a pre-workshop survey and surveyed needs. We did a site walkthrough, a sensory walkthrough with the cohort. We engaged in 4 workshops with leadership, parents, therapists, clinicians, fundraisers, lobbyists that were going to go out and get funding for the project for us. We did a focus group with adults, the autistic adults on campus, and then we also did multiple one-on-one meetings and deep dive interviews in that first round of workshopping just to set the problem statement. The building was what one might think is a very simple building. It was a sports and rec complex on a school campus, so basically a school gym and a cafeteria and a swimming pool. We've all seen them in schools, but it was very, very different in this case, and we really wanted to understand the nuance of what was happening and what it was that they were needing. And one of the important things, and again, I'll borrow language from the co-design, design thinking world of the persona. So we use, and Jody probably understands, when we talk about personas, we create these imaginary, almost caricatures of user profile. And then we walk that persona through our design to help understand how it would engage and work. So in the case of this project, the tweak that we did is that we didn't think of the persona as an individual. So of course, at the heart of that persona is the autistic student, child, or client on campus. But we understood that that persona is actually a clustered persona. That child operates in the world with their parents, their siblings, with their paras and their shadows, with their therapists and their clinicians. Not that they are not able to be independent, but their support system is so intertwined that we have to think of that cluster and how it moves through the space. So using a clustered persona is a little bit more complex because the different pieces break away as you move through the design process, but it was really very important. We then did another round of co-design with the therapists, the teachers, the clinicians that were working with the students, and did really deep dives as we were starting to spatialize the pieces. So it was like having puzzles of each of these boxes represent an element in our space program. And we were literally moving them around and clustering them and expanding them and deleting them and combining them. And we were thinking about scheduling and who does what where and when and how can we work efficiently. It was an incredibly rich process that took over 8 weeks. And we kept going back and back and back to the same teams every time with our questions. Another one of the aspects tools that I think is incredibly powerful is what we call operational asset mapping. And one of the misconceptions, I think, that we have as architects is that the assets that we're creating and designing should be measured by square meterage. So we create X number of square meters of classrooms, Y number of square meters of office space. But what we're actually creating is time. We're creating X number of hours in an inclusive classroom. We're creating X number of hours in a therapy space or in an office space. So when you start to think of your building in time, you can start assessing how much service you're going to be able to provide. So what we do is and sometimes clients are a little frustrated and confused by this, I build a schedule for the school. And I base it on, so how do you run your regular week? What does it look like? Who goes to therapy when? How many hours do they get? What is done individually? What is done as groups? And we build a schedule, and then we tell them, okay, so the program you've asked for is going to generate this number of hours across these types of therapies, and this is the asset that you have. For the scheduling you're currently running, this is what you'll utilize, and this is the resource that you're building up that you have as additional space to do future growth, to do future programming, to do after-school activities. So suddenly the asset that they have becomes very, very tangible in a language that they can understand. They can map their human resources. Are they hiring too many therapists? They only have 2 speech and language therapy rooms, and they've hired 6 speech and language therapists. So 4 of them are going to be staying in the staff lounge because we only have 2 spaces to schedule at any one time. And then you start rethinking a program that they thought was what they needed. Once you put it into this operational asset mapping tool, we start learning so many things. We know what are the resources that can then generate revenue. What are the pieces we can schedule out and provide services to external communities to generate revenue to support our schools, and so on and so forth. So it's an excellent tool that we've developed over the years with aspects. So the results of this project or this process was what my client calls the Bible. It's this report that put together all of our findings and all of our recommendations that we then were able to give to the design architect that was able to bring it forward. And luckily, again, because I'm working with a good client, they had the wisdom to hire me to do a stewardship role, to make sure that then the guidance that came out of the stakeholder, we were talking about this consultation, if it's not carried through the design process and if there's not someone that's responsible to make sure that it's listened to and followed, then it was a useless process to begin with. So we wanted to make sure that that happened. So I had the privilege to come back in and work with the designers to create this wonderful piece of work And we just broke ground on it in August, and hopefully it will be completed in the next couple of years and be open. And we are also continuing to engage with the community and are already planning research for post-occupancy and pre-occupancy so that we can close the loop on this entire process. I want to move on to autism and play. And I've promised Ben I'm going to talk about this a little bit in the context of research. So this is part of a research group, and it's inspired by a young autistic man named Elijah Delsink, who is part of a research lab that I'm working on and with in the Netherlands, led by the wonderful Professor Caroline Reef from the University of Twente. And they came to me with this incredible piece of work that they'd done about mapping children at play, and the methodology that they use here is GPS tracking and RFID sensors. And the assumption was, the research assumption was, that if children are within conversational distance for a certain period of time throughout the day during recess, then they are socially engaged. So that was the assumption, and they were trying to see if the playgrounds were supporting this social engagement or not. But the results that we found is that these data points, although we think of data as truth, each of these data points are different if the child is autistic. So the same data point for a neurotypical child that may spend X number of minutes in that conversation circle may have next to them a neurodivergent child who on the graph looks statistically identical, but when you go back with qualitative tools and have conversations with those students, you realize that those moments that we were counting as the most socially inclusive moments were some of the most socially isolating moments for the autistic students, because they were working so hard to mask and to fit in that moment, and they were so anxious that they wanted to belong, that what looked in the data that they were part of the group was in reality a very isolating experience, in some cases, not everyone. So I think it's important to even use our neurodivergent lens to look at something that we think of as so factual, like data. And another interesting thing about this research project, it was part of a grant that Caroline, myself, and many, many, many others put together. The Dutch government put out a call for research projects to combat loneliness in high school children in mainstream schools. And one of the brilliance, I think, of the application that Caroline finally put together was the outcome measure, to Rob's point earlier, what are we measuring? Wasn't how do we combat loneliness, but how do we promote a sense of belonging? So it was more an affirmative approach as opposed to a deficits approach. And the results were very interesting. So this is one of the early pilots. We've now done other pilots, and we're now continuing to work. So I was brought in the project after they had done this first set of original data collection. And my exercise was to look at these playgrounds and ask ourselves, so these playgrounds were designed in a co-design process with students and children. It's a school that has neurodivergent and neurotypical students together, playing together in these playgrounds. So my brief was to assess this against the aspects index and see if the elements that we know can support autistic children are indeed supporting all children in play. And the interesting finding is there's almost a direct correlation between the two. So some of the most correlated elements was compartmentalization, for example. So spaces that have edges, that have limits, especially those that we called sensory perches, were the most popular spaces that students played in and with. So we've continued to do this research. I'll talk about it a little bit later, but it's a continuous process and it's been extremely rewarding. So higher education. There's something that I call the invisible cliff, and it's inspired by the mother of an autistic boy that was in one of the schools I was working with. He was about to age out of the school system. He's about to turn 18 and graduate. And she looked at me and she said, everybody's talking about all the supports that he's had throughout his time at school, and it's almost as if they think my son's going to evaporate at the age of 18. No one is talking to me about what's going to happen when he ages out. There are no systems in place. There's no one that's giving me any information about the supports and what's going to happen that next day. I don't know. So higher education, in my mind, is so important. And an interesting observation I've had coming into this work in 2002, that was when there was that peak cohort. And that peak cohort that received their diagnosis in the early 2000s when we began to understand autism so well has now grown up and started entering higher education and the workplace. And that's why we're starting to see this flux of interest in higher education. So in 2019, I was invited by one of the most amazing organizations I've ever worked with, As I Am, which was founded by the brilliant Adam Harris, an autistic self-advocate. He's the CEO of the organization, and working with him are an amazing group: Fiona Harris, Georgia Harper, Sam Aaron. I was introduced through Adam to Joan McDonald, Stuart Nielsen, Kevin McLaughlin, Melena Larson, who I'll talk about in a moment, and Mary Doherty. And all of these were artistic voices that completely changed the trajectory of our work in putting together the Autism Friendly University Design Guide, which is a design guide for the world's first certified autism friendly university at Dublin City University in Ireland. It was a very consultative process. It was completely autistic voice informed from the very beginning. The motivation of the project came from As I Am and the Autistic Self-Advocacy Group and the neurodiverse students on DCU campus calling for an autism-friendly design guide. So even the brief was motivated by the autistic voice. We worked continuously with them throughout the process, and the autistic individuals also peer-reviewed the work. So we didn't send the work out to experts. We sent the work out to the real experts, who are students that are living on these campuses, and specifically Rachel Updegrove and Joshua Downs are two autistic architecture students who I worked with before they graduated, and now that they are licensed architects, they were kind enough to take a look at this guide and review it for us, and came back with very insightful results. And it was published in 2020. It's open access. Anyone can access it. It's available online. And then we designed test cases across the campus based on the findings. So one of these test cases was the Glasnevin Student Residence Students Commons. And someone was talking about creating spaces for the autistic neurodivergent need that aren't stigmatizing. And that was the objective of this student commons. It is facing the central mall. It is in the most prime location on campus. And it is designed with autistic needs first. And it's what I call reverse inclusion. So it's asking the question, what might a space look like if it's designed for autistic needs first, and then includes neurotypical needs? So neurotypical students are welcome to come in, but it is a space for the autistic students. They have agency and ownership over it, and it is space that's designed specifically for them. And in the blocks of dorms on top of the students' commons that sits at the bottom of these blocks, the original intention was for there to be autism-friendly, an autism-friendly wing. So there are suggestions, let's do an autism-friendly wing or an autism-friendly floor or an autism-friendly block. And I really resisted that because I didn't want that isolation. And I also understood that autistic students would want a whole different type of location. Some might want the busy, noisy, social room that's very close to the kitchen and the lounge. Others may want something that's quieter that overlooks the courtyard. Someone may want something that's very close to the staircase so they can come in and out and then choose when they wanted to engage. So we ended up suggesting that it be dotted throughout the housing stock, and created escape spaces at the base of the building, and also a prototype for what, even in the tiny, tiny room of a student dorm, how we could achieve that compartmentalization. So there was a discrete space for study, there was this discrete safe space for sleep, and there was a discrete and hidden space for grooming and storage. We also worked on escape spaces, but one of the other autistic voices that really informed this work was Melena Larson, a young woman an autistic student at DCU, who shared with me her sensory experience walking through campus. So, like many campuses, DCU has a central mall where students all come together, do a lot of student activities. There's a lot of music and food and dancing and celebration and just noise and bluster, and it is the most efficient way to move through campus. So Melena was explaining to me, again, to Matt's point, almost apologetically, that she doesn't actually navigate through campus that way. And she had carved for herself these little spaces in between the buildings and in the back entrances and in the bike rack spaces between and around the backs of buildings so that she could navigate through the buildings. And I found that such incredible autistic expertise that we formalized that and suggested to the master planners of campus that we create, and we called it the Melena pathway. So this sensory pathway that's quieter, that's softer, that's dotted with what I call the escape space, the escape-scape, a series of escape spaces along a gradient of dynamics, so moving swings to static benches, open benches to little egg cocoon chairs, places where a large group could congregate or you could sit as an individual. And all of this multi-gradient typologies were dotted across this Milena pathway. So as you navigated through campus, you would always have a space to retreat to as you're moving along. And just the other day, before I met Ben, I took a walk here on your own campus to assure you that you have a lot of your own Milena pathway infrastructure here. There are a lot of beautiful, quiet spaces, vegetation, little benches that are hidden and tucked away and off the main pathway. And I think knowing that you have this infrastructure, it would not be a difficult stretch to then stitch it together and make it a system for that type of sensory exploration around campus. So another voice that really influenced my work, Stuart Nielsen, and Stuart shared these images with me. He's an autistic data researcher, statistician. I call him an artist. He now has started calling himself an artist as well. He shared these images with me in 2019 when we met in Dublin. They were inspired by the Aspects Guide and the Aspects Principles, and they are his way of brilliantly using photography and video and computer analysis of images to represent the way he sees the world. And Stuart was invited back to Dublin City University after we did the Autism-Friendly Design Guide to take a look at these sensory pathways. So the image to the right is the Milena pathway. You see the softness, you see the vegetation, and then this is the harsh mall to the left. And Stuart also does these very, very beautiful, very, very powerful video analysis. So this was another example of some of the principles at DCU, that moment of arrival. So when you arrive to DCU campus at that entry point, there's this expansive paved plaza that has no visual rules to how it is that you're supposed to navigate through it. And that, to Stuart, was very stressful. So he used video to understand the desire lines, and that became the blueprint for proposals of how we could create new paving. It could be as simple as just painting lines on the pavement. It doesn't have to be an expensive rebuild. But this idea of signifying through design how spaces are intended to be used so that it's easier for individuals who are neurodivergent, who seek that, would use them. Stuart also came in to look at the dining hall and was looking at the crowding and the different systems and the different spaces and the way people were moving through them. And just last September, I was back in Dublin. Adam is the wonderful gentleman here to the left, and this is a video of him presenting to Irish Parliament, to a commission to consider autism-friendly design guidance in their public enterprises and public funding and public initiatives. And again, Adam is possibly the most effective advocate, effective individual I've ever seen in his work. And he has succeeded now through the advocacy that he's been doing and lobbying through, as I am, and the wonderful team that works with him, to reach the point where Dublin, the mayor of Dublin, and I was with Adam at the mayor's house in Dublin in September, where he announced that Dublin is going to become, and he's pledging for it to become, the world's first autism-friendly capital anywhere in the world. So moving to a different context, higher education looks different everywhere. Europe, the United States. So this is from a project at St. Joseph's University, the Kinney Center. The Kinney Center is very interesting because it brings autistic students onto campus. They're called part of the Aspire program. And the Kinney Center both supports the Aspire students, but it also provides programming for families of individuals with autism in the community. And it is a space for teachers to get their special education training. So it's this wonderful program that's so interesting that I haven't seen replicated anywhere else in the world, that sits on a university campus, is part of a university campus, serves university students that are neurodivergent, but also helps graduate teachers that are educated in how we should teach and support neurodivergent students. My work with Mix takes this kind of learning also to higher ed. This is a principle, we call it multisensory wayfinding, that myself, my partner Joel Sanders, and Hansel Baumann worked on. The lab that Ben introduced at the beginning, Mix Design. We have 3 design labs. I run the Autism and Neuro-Inclusive Design Lab at Mix. Joel runs the Gender and Sexuality Lab at Mix, and Hansel runs the Sensory Lab. Hansel is famously known for one of the authors of the Deaf Space Guide. But this simple system is a thought experiment of what a circulation space could look like if it were to provide for the breadth of these experiences. So we were talking a lot about these access conflicts. If you design for the blind experience, you may exclude the deaf experience, and if you design for the neurodivergent experience, you may exclude a wheelchair user's experience. So how can you create something as simple as a wayfinding system that would allow for all of those experiences to coexist and navigate safely? And that became the archetype for a project we worked on and is now is now under construction at Princeton University campus, the Hobson Residential College Dormitory for Students. And it's a very porous, so that wayfinding, multisensory wayfinding principle informed a lot of the design. JSA Mix was the interior architect for the project. Hilbury and Pau are the prime architects. But it's a very porous campus, and what I think is interesting here is these little microclimates that we created using these templates of these sensory-friendly materials and these little microclimates that are dotted along the pathway that all students, and this is a great example of how something that may have been inspired by the lens of disability can help provide for all students. And what could be a very daunting, sensationalistic building is actually incredibly accessible. So just some tools so that we can be practical. So one of the tools that we use is we call building choreography. I tell my students architecture is the negotiation between the choreography of people's behavior within a very well understood context. Architecture is what happens in that space in between. So our first task is to understand the choreography. So this is a diagram that was the result of that ELSE for Autism stakeholder engagement process. My colleague Camille Esquivel calls this is a snapshot of Magda's brain and how she's thinking about the building. So it basically does a task analysis of moment of arrival to exit into this sports and recreation complex. And the 3 layers are the 3 activity bundles. So wet activities in the pool, dry activities in the gym, social activities in the cafeteria and flex space. And I just want to talk for one moment about the importance of swimming curriculum. The pool in this project was not seen as a luxury or something fun for the children to do. It is a life-saving piece of life skills that students on the spectrum must have. The number 1 cause for death in the United States of autistic children is drowning. So this foundation and the school committed that every child on this campus would learn at least basic life-saving swimming skills. So the pool here is really part of their everyday curriculum. The building design itself followed that choreography. And it's supported by what we call the sensory infrastructure. So as you can imagine, an autistic individual arriving to a building to go to the gym or to go to a basketball club or to go to a pool can be a very overstimulating experience and possibly a stressful experience, particularly if they have a fear of water or if they've been in a gym before and it's really loud and bouncy and overwhelming. So we built in this sensory infrastructure. You can see here some of those little purple pods that we had, and also some of the overlooking sensory perches that students can sit in before they arrive to spaces to peek into them, to understand and predict what is going to happen in them, and that can be very supportive. So what I'm working on right now is developing a series of rating scales, assessment tools, and certification. So Hansel and I have been looking at the alignment between aspects 2.0 and deaf space, and where are these commonalities and where are these conflicts. We're also looking at standards like well building. Well building just launched a multi-sensory design standard and is using aspects as one of the referenced evidence for that work. I'm also working with the Building for Belonging group in the Netherlands with Caroline and her colleagues to develop a neurodiversity rating scale. We're starting with the playgrounds work, but we hope to generalize it up to schools, higher ed campuses, cities, and other places so that we can have a rating scale that would then inform an aspect certification system. So the hope is at the conclusion of this project, as we're testing it out and validating it, that we would be able to make available to those who are interested a certification system for the aspects friendliness and aspects compliance of their buildings. So very quickly, I think learning happens again across the whole lifespan. And my work with hospitals and healthcare, and I'll speak of this very quickly, was inspired by Mary Doherty, who's a wonderful woman, received a late diagnosis as autistic, and is the founder of Autistic Doctors. And she brought to my attention the healthcare access crisis. And they had been, in her work, using some of our aspects principles, and she shared with me some of the things they were doing in the emergency room, simple things like sensory spaces and escape spaces. She says it's saving their patients' lives because they saw an uptake of autistic patients who prior were not coming to the hospital for care and were delaying care. So we work in hospitals, again, using these sensory infrastructures. Museums are also spaces because we believe everyone has the right to have access to every space. Universal design is not only universal design, it's universal delight. Everyone should be able to access spaces that bring us joy, like museums. This is a piece that we did critiquing the Charlottenburg Palace in Copenhagen. I was invited to do a little imaginary of what it would look like if it were neuro-inclusive, because as the home for the Royal School of Art, it is very exclusionary of the neurodivergent experience. So finally, as I close, aspects in the learning city, and I just want to give credit to Eric Kaufmill and a name I won't disclose. I was in the United Nations speaking to the Commission for the Rights of People with Disabilities after 3 years of lobbying by Autistic Minority International, a self-advocacy group. They finally got an audience with the UN CRPD and invited me and shared that platform with me. On the morning of that meeting, Eric's colleague communicated with him that after 3 years of hopeful preparation, he was unable to come to the meeting because he could not leave his house. He was too overwhelmed to get on the train in Geneva to come to the headquarters where he was going to present something that he had been dreaming of for 3 years. And that made very clear to me the importance of working on that city infrastructure in between. And I'm going to pause this for a second. There is some sound that's going to come on. If anyone wants to take a moment, I'll bring down the sound to put on noise-canceling headphones because we do have some audio that's coming on in a minute. So in this exhibition at the Venice Biennale in 23, we crowdsourced autistic experiences from around the world, and then we installed them in this experimental installation and tested people's interactions to this space. So we were trying to simulate what would it be like to be in a city as an autistic individual, and then what would it be like to have the opportunity to step away from that for a moment. Hundreds of thousands of people visited the Biennale exhibition that year. We got a cohort of about 250 individuals, neurodivergent and neurotypical, almost 50%, responded to a survey. And we went into this anecdotally knowing that these types of supports help everyone. All of us get overwhelmed in our cities and would love to step away. What we didn't realize that the delta of impact was almost statistically identical across neurodivergent and neurotypicals. So that means it is as helpful for the neurotypical experience. It's not only helpful, it is as helpful as it is for the neurodivergent experience, at least in this small little experiment. And we've taken these lessons to work that we're doing now in Pennsylvania Avenue with the Land Collective, and also working with Hansel Baumann, Karen Breitmeyer, to think about accessibility through these lenses of the neurodivergent city. And I'll just close with this notion of reverse inclusion. And these types of talks are a great opportunity for me to look back on my work, So what began in the 2000s that was very much in the medicalized model where autism was seen as an object. We then moved to a place where autism was seen as a subject to study. But then as I worked with and met and collaborated with more and more autistic individuals, I realized that autism is a very powerful agent of change. And then autism is also an incredible source of expertise that outstrips any of our own in understanding how to design. And most recently, I've been able to also co-author and learn from, and some of them were here yesterday, Autism and Neurodivergence itself as authorship of new research. So I'll close with this final beautiful image by my friend and collaborator, Stuart Nielsen. He calls it Lockdown. And it's a great example of when we look through the neurodivergent and autistic lens, we see things that we would normally never see. So this is a video that Stuart created during lockdown in COVID when the streets of Cork where he lived were empty and the jackdaws, the seagulls, were able to move through the street. And he was able to trace their pathway and realize that they were replicating the fabric of the street as they moved. So they were almost tracing the street in the sky. And that is a realization that I doubt anyone but an autistic mind could have discovered, and it's those types of realizations that I think should inform our work. Thank you.
Well, Magda, there's been a reason we've been excited about you coming for the last 7 or 8 months, and certainly I think, what you've shared with us, this trajectory we've been on, at least for today and probably yesterday as well, from what are the challenges to what are some of the solutions that we actually know about and we can activate. Certainly, if you haven't engaged with Magda's work and the aspects, design guidelines, you can certainly see the value in doing so. I think a lot of people did know, and that's why they're here. It's been absolutely wonderful. We've got a few more days to do a few smaller engagements and so on, and I think a few people who are still here will engage with those. So thank you. I have been getting to hurry on. Mm-hmm. One of the things we'd like to do, for those of you who are here, is there's a request to have a photograph with those who would like to be in it out in the foyer. Obviously, Magda will pop you down the front. But if you'd like to be in a photograph, the invitation is to come and have a drink. We might do the photograph first, sure, and then engage in a drink. We're not going to do questions because we've run out of time, but we can do questions informally over refreshments outside. Sure. I also need to close the symposium. So, look, it's been a real journey over the 2 days. Today has been, bigger and perhaps even broader in some ways than yesterday. But I think so many people have contributed to this exercise of bringing different disciplines together, of having a really rich conversation about, all of the multifacets that will lead to more inclusive environments in our learning institutions. I think the ambition from here is to carry on these conversations. Some of us have been having them in different pockets, but there hasn't really been a cohesion to some of these conversations. So we hope to sort of provide a platform for further engagement by those who would like to engage. So look out for communications coming from our group, coming from our research project. We don't hope to own it, we just hope to facilitate. And so hopefully, that the network of effects can be magnified, not only here, but internationally as well. Okay. So thank you all for coming. It's been great to have you here. It's been great to have your input. Thanks to everyone who's contributed. I've got to say another special thanks to Lizzle Gay and Sarah Backhouse, who did such a lot of work to make this all happen, plus all of those who have volunteered as well. There's actually too many to name, so I'm just going to name 2, and that's kind of safe. Let's go and do the photograph, have a drink, and engage in that last little conversation we want to have before we ought to head home. Thank you all, and thank you to Magda.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You.